My guest again today is Douglas Pollock.
I'm a civil industrial engineer from the University of Chile, and over the past 10 years, I have studied the science of climate change and the economic impact of climate and energy policies. Regarding renewables, I have been able to identify and to prove the rationality of these energies along with the extremely adverse consequences for Western economies that are increasingly using them in replacement of affordable and abundant conventional energy sources, openly challenging, in addition, the illusion of net zero emissions towards year 2050. I have attended several international conferences, both in the US and in Europe, and presented my research and findings in more than 25 countries, as well as in various US and European mainstream energy and climate web journals. Just a few days ago, I finished my book that has the same title and cover of this presentation as you can see there. I will try to explain in the simplest possible way why the cost of electricity inevitably increases as wind and solar generation expand on a power grid, that only in an ideal scenario can a slight reduction in CO2 emissions be achieved, making renewables economically ineffective for that purpose, that there is a fundamental limit for renewables above which the cost of electricity skyrockets exponentially, that they hinder CO2 emissions reduction when used to replace coal generation, and the cost of the attempt to achieving the net zero utopia through the use of its lethal weapons, also known as green energy sources, clean, sustainable, resilient, most affordable, and engines of development, which, at the expense of the West, will prevent the planet from a non-existent disaster. Now, let's go getting the record straight with the main energy sources used for electricity generations, which are the ones you can see there, that are categorized as renewables, non-conventional, non-pollutant, and if they emit or they don't emit greenhouse gases. As you can see there, solar, wind, and geothermal perfectly comply with all those requirements. But we will focus on these three: biomass, hydropower, and nuclear power. Why is this? Because biomass, for instance, is not conventional, but it pollutes and it emits a lot of CO2, while hydro, being renewable, is considered non-conventional, but despite it doesn't pollute and doesn't emit CO2. The same as nuclear, which is considered non-renewable, that is correct, and also does not emit CO2 and is not a pollutant generation source. So this is inconsistent. So we must clear up what is going on here. Strangely, despite the fact that hydronuclear energies are stable, abundant, affordable, and contribute decisively to the economy of any country, many governments in the so-called free world, pressured by UN mandates or forced by regional supergovernments like the EU, have decided to dismantle these two important sources, nuclear and hydro, of electricity, citing various justifications. For instance, Germany, that recently closed its last 3 nuclear power plants due to the baseless fear of repeating the 2011 Fukushima nuclear incident, or Europe, that as a whole closed or dismantled 542 reservoirs and river barriers only in 2024 to meet its goal of restoring nature and biodiversity. The biomass fuel for electricity generation is wood pellets. In comparison with coal, quality pellets, that is, wood compressed and dried down to 10%, have a 40 to 50% lower energy content. The kiln drying process requires energy equivalent to more than half of its heat potential. Wood is inherently more pollutant than coal, has a higher generation cost, and emits between 50 and 85% more CO2 into the atmosphere than coal. But biomass is considered renewable and serves to prevent climate change, unlike the heretical coal. Furthermore, it is hardly renewable, since while burning a tree to produce electricity or for heating takes 100 minutes, its renewability may well take 100 years. Thus, the ecological damage caused, for example, in British Columbia in Canada, by the massive deforestation to supply the Drax power plant in England, Yorkshire, that switched its cogeneration to the non-regulated biomass, has been tolerated without any problem. Now, let's go to what I call the green obviousness or the green argument, which is the basis of all renewables installed in the West. We have three premises, or two. The first one that states that fuel cost of renewables is zero, which is correct, it's true. The second one, that renewables don't burn fossil fuels. Perfectly well. True statement. And the third one, that the cost of renewables, meaning the investment cost of the capex, has sharply decreased over the last 10 or 15 years, which is also true because all the heavy industry of renewables moved from the West to China because of the high cost of energy in the West. Three true statements that obviously derive in a very easy to follow conclusions that electricity prices must drop, of course, and CO2 emissions also. But what happens when there is no cause-effect relationship between statements and conclusions? The entire argument becomes non-valid. And why is this? Because we have the facts. What tells us this is that there's no country around the world, not even one, that can show the opposite, that when increasing the renewable generation, the price of electricity, whether it is industrial or domestic, will drop. No one whatsoever. At the top left, you have the case of the United States and the damage caused in all around Europe. And what about CO2 emissions? Well, yes, it seems that thanks to renewables, while increasing renewable generation, CO2 emissions have dropped in Germany, in Italy, in the United Kingdom, and in France. But was it thanks to renewable, or rather because generation in those countries came down? No, if thanks to renewable, would say advocates of renewables. Why? Because we have the case of the United States. While increasing renewables, decreasing CO2 emissions, also that country increased its generation slightly, but it did. So this is done. The debate is over, as the UN likes to say, and obviously, thanks to renewables, CO2 emissions will go down everywhere around the world. But wait a minute. This is correlation, and correlation not necessarily imply causation, as you can see. So we must prove this. And how are we going to prove it? We will build a very simple cost structure consisting in a thermal and a renewable generation source, let's say a wind power plant onshore and a combined cycle power station, each one with its technical and cost variables that will derive to what we know as the levelized cost of electricity, which stands for the minimum revenue required to build and operate a generator over a cost recovery period, and is a sum of the capital cost, fuel, maintenance and operations, and transmissions cost of electricity. And it's useful because to a certain extent, because it uses common units. that allow us to compare different costs between and within generation technologies. But certainly it does not explain the cost of electricity of an integrated system, because levelized cost of electricity considers a grid as an isolated system. So it does not serve, but is used by advocates and promoters of renewables to prove that renewables today, as you can see in the center squares there, are very similar. Even renewables today are cheaper than thermal generation sources, which is absolutely bogus. We will see why. For example, in the case of the renewable generation source, for having that cost, that means that the capacity factor of that source should be about 44%, something nothing seen around the world. A normal for a wind turbine would be 30 up to 35, not 44. And in the case of the thermal source, the investment cost to have that $40 per megawatt hour of cost should have to be about $2.5 million per megawatt of installed capacity, which is also ridiculous because that cost ranges today between $600,000 and $1.2 million, not $2.5. So correcting these numbers, we go down to 29 for the thermal cost and 81 for the renewable generation source, in this case onshore wind turbines. But this is not all. It does not explain the cost of an integrated system, which is the case of a grid, an interconnected system. So we must see what happens in an integrated system, and what was missing is all of the above. When we increase renewable generation, together with reducing the thermal generation, because in every moment, the sum of both must be equal to the demand. We cannot play around with that equality. So we increase renewables, we decrease thermal generation. But what happens here is that the fuel consumption of the thermal source will increase. Why is this? Because of the intermittencies coming from renewables. That means that a fraction of the thermal source will have to operate up and down, ramping up and down every time following weather patterns instead of following the demand, operating at best load or efficiently. That means that the fuel cost will go up, given by capital H there, which is the operating heat rate in megabtu by megawatt hours. That is the one that goes up. This is the same as your car driving in a highway at a constant speed, let's say it's 80 miles per hour, compared to your car driving in a city. The more you drive your car during a month in a city, the more fuel consumption you will have. This is the same. Lowercase e is the cost of energy in dollars per megabtu, and F, capital F, is the fuel cost of electricity. That is the one that goes up when we increase renewables. So the question arises immediately is that why don't we get rid of renewables and we use instead only thermal generation? Because of that little thing up there called the merit order, which is an economic criteria by which the grid selects, or the system selects in every moment, the generator that is exhibiting the least marginal cost or variable cost, in this case, the fuel cost. And the fuel cost for renewables is zero. Then, in having available the dispatchable electricity in a given moment, renewables will be always selected over other sources of generation. So, but this is not all. As I said, as we increase renewable generation, then, despite the thermal generation will go down, the fuel consumption will go up. In the case of the United States, the renewable generation fraction today for year 2023, that's the available data for the United States, was 14%. And in that range, at that level, the thermal cost of electricity will go up to $35.5 per megawatt. And now we have the figures to estimate which is the full cost of electricity that is the only one that matters, and know where to see. And this is the one, the full cost of electricity, which is the sum of the levelized cost of electricity weighted by their respective generation fraction in the grid. As I said, in the case of the United States, 14% for renewable generation. Now, and there you have. The cost is something in between the two levelized costs. Now let's see what happens with the generation in the absence of renewables. Well, this is very simple. We have only one thermal generation source consisting in a baseload efficient continuous generation and a non-baseload fraction consisting in inefficient generation for peak and off-peak demand. Every grid has this. But in the presence of renewables, things get a bit messy because now we had, as you can see, the dark gray bar there, we have to take or consider a fraction of the thermal source to back up renewables operating inefficiently as non-base load generation. Because renewables more or less behave this way. When there's enough wind and sun, then all the installed capacity of renewables will be able to operate at full load capacity, meaning that apparently there will be no need of thermal generation. This is absolutely a mistake, wrong. Why is this? Because behind the beautiful green bar there, there's a ghost hidden somewhere else in the grid operating at idle speed or spinning reserve or rotating reserve, burning fuel without generating electricity, waiting for the wind or the sun to go away, to then quickly ramp up to satisfy the demand. Because when the wind and sun go away, then the thermal source will have to fully replace renewables. In average, both generations are equal. And that is the case with renewables, we must add. And that is why the fuel consumption, thus the fuel cost, will always increase, making the levelized cost of thermal source to increase also. Now, here we get to the first rule of thumb. This is a mandate, because if we demand grid stability, then for every megawatt hour of renewable generation, there must be at least 1 megawatt of thermal capacity for backup and ready to deliver energy to dispatch electricity when the wind and sun go away. Now, we can see this in the graph as an isolated system within a certain range below that F max over there. The levelized cost of a renewable generation source will remain constant because of the merit order, but above that limit, the thermal source will increase from the beginning for the reasons I just explained, mainly because the fuel consumption will go up. But above this limit, where we start verifying an overflow or loss of renewable electricity, I will go through this in detail afterwards, then the more installed capacity we put in the grid coming from renewables will provide or dispatch less and less electricity. So the more installed capacity will be distributed now in a lesser amount of generation dispatched to the grid, while the thermal levelized cost will still go up because there will still be need to back up renewables. But what about if we see this from the grid perspective or as an integrated system? Well, now the levelized cost here is weighted by its generation fraction, so it starts increasing from zero onwards linearly up to this maximum and exponentially after that maximum, while the weighted levelized thermal cost will slightly drop. And why is this? This is the case for a very efficient thermal generator, by which the increase in that cost is not able to offset or to cancel the effect of reducing its generation, and that makes the weighted thermal cost to slightly drop. But in any case, the sum of both will always result in an increase in the total or full load of generation, whatever it takes. It doesn't matter what you do with renewables, you can reduce the investment cost, you can increase the capacity factor, whatever it takes, the full cost of electricity will always increase, and exponentially after this maximum. There you have the same figures I showed before. This is the case for United States with a 14% of renewable generation fraction in the grid. Now, let's jump to CO2 emissions. There are three ways to reduce CO2 emissions. The first one is the trivial one, by generating less electricity, as it is we just saw of France, Italy, Spain, United Kingdom, and Germany. The second one by replacing coal generation with natural gas, which is mostly a case for the United States. And the third case, in theory, by increasing renewables while proportionally reducing fossil fuel-based generation. Let's see if that is so. Because only, and I repeat, only in ideal generators that only uses natural gas to back up renewables, we can see a slight reduction, the red line in the graph, of CO2 emissions reduction. In this case, the CO2 output emissions rate, the blue line, increases. This is equivalent to the operating heat rate. Actually, it's the same. Increases because the fuel consumption increases. But again, that increase is not able to cancel or to offset the effect of reducing the thermal generation, making CO2 emissions to slightly drop. But in most cases around the world, where other sources to back up renewables are also used, such as a larger fraction of simple cycle gas turbines, oil, or even coal, as the case of Australia, well, now CO2 output emissions rate will increase so much that this time won't be able to cancel the effect of reducing the thermal generation, making the total CO2 emissions of the grid to increase. And this is an insane scenario because renewables were meant to reduce, not to increase CO2 emissions. Let's see now what happens with the situation that most of Europe, Chile, and Australia are experiencing today. What happens with this limit and what is this limit? Now, which is the nameplate capacity or the installed capacity needed to satisfy the fraction F of the total generation in the grid is given by the left in the red box at the left. It's N capacity, nameplate capacity, equals to the generation fraction times the hourly demand divided by Z, which is the capacity factor of the renewable generation source in this case. And we will explain this in an easy way through a sine curve that is more or less what it goes on with solar panels in a clear day. In the case of Norway, for instance, operating at full load capacity with its current installed capacity, it will match at most 33% of the hourly demand, meaning that Norway could easily continue to increase its renewable capacity because it won't touch the hourly demand. Like the case of the United States, that is 66% of the hourly demand. So the United States can continue increasing its installed capacity of renewables. But what happens when we reach and we touch the dotted horizontal line up there when the nameplate capacity matches the hourly demand? Well, let's replace N equals D, which is the case of Finland, in the left equation, and we immediately get that the maximum renewable generation fraction in a grid is equal to its capacity factor. And what happens after that? Well, we lose excess generation. That is as simple as that. And you can see the cases of Chile, the only nation in the Americas, from Canada to Antarctica, that is in red and has 53% of excess generation capacity. And the worst of all around the world is Germany, with 2.84 times the hourly demand. Now, that excess generation is expressed in that formula up there, where E is the excess generation capacity, will be equal to the difference between the nameplate capacity of renewables and the hourly demand. And this was devised by the genius of Lord Christopher Monckton, or the end for renewables. And then there we have the main two formulas that should be taken into account by the West. This is yet not the case of the United States, but you're getting very, very close. And I believe that this 66% would have been the last year. And from here on, you could easily expect that that number will quickly drop. Now, we can explain this through this graph. There you have the case for the United States. Its current national capacity factor for weight to all renewable generation, solar and wind, is 26%. You are standing now at 14%. Now, if you continue to increase the renewable generation, the generation of renewables will increase linearly below that limit, which is the same as to say that the thermal generation will decrease linearly because the sum of both in this example must equal 100 terawatt hours per year. But beyond that limit, the thermal generation will drop exponentially while the renewable generation will escalate logarithmically, or the rate of increase will have a behavior of an exponential decay, This is the same as to say that, the loss of electricity starting by N divided by D equals 1, or the maximum limit, will start increasing exponentially. And this is the same as to say that below this limit, the capacity factor of renewables will remain constant and will be a weather pattern. But beyond that limit, which is actually what renewable facilities see in real life, is that it will experience an exponential decay. It is easy to understand that to have 100% of renewable generation in a grid, you will need infinite renewable installed capacity. That is why it's impossible for a grid to have 100% of renewable generation, as politicians like to say. Let's see what's going on with the U.S. regarding or compared with in a global context. The first place, we have the three regions that have largely passed this limit. The worst of all is Australia as a region. Within Europe, there are countries that are much worse than Australia, like Spain, United Kingdom, Ireland, and most of all Germany. But as a continent, Europe is a bit better than Australia. China, I really don't believe these figures for China because it's very difficult. Year 22, China was placed at 1, exactly in the limit. So it's very difficult to believe that China in only 1 year increased its installed capacity of renewables in 23%. I believe China should be quite below that red stripe there. And then we have the rest of the world. The world is in at 85%. Latin America is very similar to the United States, only worsened by Brazil, that is in exactly 1, and Chile is in 1.53. Otherwise, Latin America would be something like Africa. And finally, we have Russia, that has almost no installed capacity of renewables. Now, let's see what has been the case for the United States regarding CO2 emissions abatement attributable only to renewables. And this is very interesting. We will first of all compare 2 years, 6 years, from 2018 up to 2023. In 2018, the United States has a renewable generation fraction of 8%, and today, or year 2023, is in 14%. Year 2018, when that installed capacity, the U.S. was able to reduce CO2 emissions only attributable to renewables in 5 million tons of CO2, and today, almost 35 million tons. But what does this mean? For year 23, it means that compared to or with respect to the grid, it's only 1.5% of CO2 emissions reduction. Compared to the nation, 0.5, and compared to a world almost zero, meaning that the world haven't noticed the tremendous effort made by the second largest emitter of CO2 around the world. It's simply insignificant. You can't notice it. And this gets worse because, in fact, yes, the United States did reduce CO2 emissions through over this 6 years by 447 million tons, but only 4% attributable to renewables, support 5%, and 95% thanks to changing cogeneration by natural gas. You see a difference? So the impact of renewables in reducing CO2 emissions is very, very tiny. Now, this is very interesting because here we show how renewables hinder. If we really need to reduce CO2 emissions, which is not the case, of course, the best thing to do is go directly from cogeneration directly to natural gas without using renewables. Why is this? The first row shows that if we only, or the United States, would only use natural gas to back up renewables, then going from cogeneration directly to natural gas generation would reduce CO2 emissions almost 20% more than going from cogeneration to natural gas to renewables, but with the use only of natural gas as backup to renewables. But it happens, this is the second row, that the United States also uses all kinds of fuels and technologies to back up these beautiful green energy sources. So, in the real case scenario, going from cogeneration directly to natural gas generation will reduce CO2 emissions 67% more than going from cogeneration to renewables, but with the use of all kinds of fuels and technologies to back up these renewables. So in conclusion, in most Western countries, reducing CO2 emissions have largely been achieved replacing coal directly by natural gas generation rather than replacing coal by renewables. Another reason to get rid of renewables. Now let's go to the famous cost of net zero. One of the most realistic cost assessments of driving a national grid to net zero towards 2050 is from the UK National Grid 2022 report. According to that study, driving its electricity grid to net zero would cost $3.8 trillion. By making a direct linear extrapolation, where the UK grid emits 33.2% of British total emissions, the cost of net zero would be $16.4 trillion. This is an estimate, an order of magnitude, not a precise and accurate calculation, of course, but it gives you an idea of what would cost to any country this green adventure. So, if we calculate this in the basis of times the GDP of different nations, would come to this. And there you have, the United Kingdom would cost, with data from year 2024 this time, 5.3 times its GDP, 8.2 times for the United States, for Chile, not to talk about, the worst of all, and for the world, 17.2 times the world's GDP, something economically impossible to achieve. But wait a moment, perhaps it deserves to be taken into account because we will say global warming will prevent the planet from global warming. Well, let's see how much. And there we have the figures, the same figures of the United Nations in their AR6 or 6th assessment report of year 2021. The total, we could prevent global warming from rising 0.098 degrees Celsius in 25 years if the entire world went to net zero. Interpolated for the United States, that means that wasting 8.2 times the US 2024 GDP the United States would prevent the planet from warming 0.01 degrees Celsius. That is the magnitude of this nonsense. Now, before going to the conclusions, I will show you the 10 top features of renewables. 6 of them we just spoke about in this presentation. They are extremely expensive. They make the electricity price to inevitably increase. They destabilize a power grid because they lack of mechanical inertia that only can be given by thermal generation sources with these huge rotating generators. They cannot generate electricity by themselves alone. There's a need of backup. They don't necessarily reduce CO2 emissions or prevent global warming. They obstruct CO2 emissions reduction. And last but not the least, they are low-density energy, meaning that in two orders of magnitude, they use land and materials to produce the same amount of energy. They are non-recyclable. They're the most pollutant of all energy sources because renewables have shown while producing electricity from the showcase onwards until they finish their lifetime or project lifetime, not upstream in the manufacturing, mining, and building stages. And finally, they kill birds, bats, and endangered whales. And this part, endangered whales, had been addressed by your President Trump many times during his rallies. Now, conclusions. By increasing renewable generation, regarding costs, the cost of electricity inevitably increases regardless of any improvements for renewables, such as a reduction in their investment cost or an increase in their capacity factor. The only way to reduce the cost of electricity is by a fall in the fuel cost and or going back to coal generation like in China and India and hopefully today in the United States. The cost increase here analyzed strongly aggravated by the introduction of costly and damaging market interferences, especially when exceeding the limit for renewables, such as cancellation, curtailment, or constrained generation orders and capacity payments that have the effect of subsidizing wind and solar generation for non-existent additional power at the expense of customers. The customers must pay the loss of electricity. They pay for something that does not exist. That's the nonsense of all this. But they have to pay, and this is the case of Europe and Chile and Australia. It's not the case yet for the United States, except in places like California, New York, and others, when you analyze it state by state. But as a country, you don't have yet that problem. Now, regarding CO2 emissions, although making electricity increasingly expensive, a meager CO2 emissions abatement can be achieved in ideal grids, thus making renewables economically ineffective for this purpose. But in real-world grids, where simple cycle gas turbines or fuels other than natural gas are also used to back up renewables, CO2 emissions rise, making renewables an irrational solution for the same purpose. The efficient way to reduce CO2 emissions, if needed, which is not, although more expensive, is by reducing coal directly by natural gas generation, getting rid of renewables, which only hinders such reduction. And yes, there is a fundamental limit. Adding more wind and solar capacity above this limit, the increase in renewable generation follows an exponential decay, while electricity loss an exponential increase. When wind and solar nameplate capacity exceeds the mean hourly demand limit, then both new and existing renewable generators will receive less and less money per megawatt of installed capacity. Furthermore, this will even get worse, as many Western nations are increasingly experiencing, as we just saw, a decline in electricity demand due to ever-rising rates. And the West's biggest mistake, consisting in an asymmetric renewable expansion by decommissioning coal-based capacity without proportionally increasing backup gas-fired generation capacity. Dark clouds on the horizon that I believe have reached today to the entire Europe, to Chile, and many places in the United States, such as Texas 4 years ago. And harmful economic consequences, the high and ever-rising electricity prices, coupled with taxes, regulations, subsidies, and grid instability because of renewables expansion, have brought harmful economic consequences to the West, such as the loss of competitiveness, severe decline in economic growth, abrupt investment break, and capital and industrial exodus, inflation, unemployment, and wealth-poverty gap increase. And the net zero is in any case impossible simply because the amount of rare earth metals resources is infinitely lower than what would be needed, thus a genocidal and insane utopia trying to become true by imposing extremely expensive green dead weight energies, parasites of every grid and every economy. Western governments, obsessed with unsuccessfully reducing CO2 emissions, with oppressive climate policies and energy transition agendas towards net zero, have put decarbonization before affordability, reliability, and energy security, heading towards a self-inflicted economic collapse, and to the loss of energy independence and security of the free world nations without any measurable impact on climate whatsoever. Meanwhile, over the last 8 years, for every megawatt hour of coal generation capacity decommissioned in the world, 2.4 megawatt hours of that same capacity have been built in China and India. And for every ton of CO2 emissions reduction in the world, 18.1 tons have been added to the atmosphere by these two nations. In the case of the United States, these ratios become 3.3 megawatt hours and 10.9 tons respectively. Hamlet's dilemma, to be or not to be, that is the question, which means to live or die through suicide, is analog to the other, to renewable or not to renewable, that is the question, through an economic suicide. Perhaps with a farewell to climate change, 2025 will be remembered as the year when the USA once again chose a path to sovereignty, freedom, and prosperity. For the rest of the West, times of green romanticism have run out, and today its leaders find themselves at a crossroad. Either will they continue demonizing CO2 by imposing destructive economic policies, throwing nations off the cliff in the name of saving the planet from a non-problem, or will they finally acknowledge that CO2, apart from being harmless, colorless, odorless, non-polluting, and not capable of changing neither the Earth's temperature and its climate, is instead essential for plant and animal life on our world? Whether the rest of the world, the West, will follow the same virtuous path chosen by the United States is something yet to be seen. And that is the end for Renewables. Thank you so much.
Just to be clear, what is the name of your book and where can we get your new book?
Oh, the same as the title. to NCRE, that means non-conventional renewable energies, okay? To NCRE and or not to NCRE, that is a question. And it's the same image there of this whole man with a planet full of renewables.
Okay. Well, was
No,
that
it hasn't been published. I just finished it, and now I will publish it. It's in Spanish. I hope I will translate it into English.
all right?
It's a
But
very short one. It's not more than 50 pages.
one other thing you said jumped out at me. Can you expand at all on this whole idea of cutting wood over here in North America and then drying it and sending it off to England to be burned?
The energy needed to dry the wood down to 10% requires more or less half the energy content of wood pellets.
Okay.
Yeah, that's it.
Overall, is that one of the single craziest renewable energy schemes? The whole that wood pellet thing, or where do you rank that in terms of not making any sense?
Well, yes, as I explained at the beginning, if you see biomass is considered non-conventional, although it pollutes and emits more CO2 than coal. But coal is considered conventional, and it's making the planet to warm. So this is nonsense. This is ridiculous. Contradictory, absolutely. If we need really to reduce CO2 emissions and we only have two sources of generation, coal and biomass, we should choose coal, not biomass. That's as simple as that.
So looking around the world, it sounds like you are sort of optimistic about the U.S. maybe making some better energy choices. But someone was just saying that Germany, do you see any hope for Germany in kind of switching over to energy reality or not?
Well, yes, I understand that Germany is going back to coal because if they don't, they run out of electricity, as simple as that. But in year 2023, 2 years ago, they finished closing the last 3 generators. This is a process that began in 2011 after the Fukushima incident, and they closed from 2021 to 2023. They closed their last 6 nuclear facilities, and they don't have none today. They don't have coal, and they buy natural gas to Russia. How about that? So Germany should be today fighting the first place in electricity costs around the world, together with Ireland. And Ireland is the most expensive in Europe, followed by Germany and Denmark, because of the green fantasy.
So it does sound like you've been to lots of different countries talking about renewable energy reality.
One was very interesting because was made to the U.S. government back in 2019 when Trump took office for the first time. No, Trump was in office.
Yep.
Yeah, I talked there in the Trump Hotel, quite close to the White House. And the rest of the times have been through Zoom in many countries, as I said, through Clinton to more or less 37 countries, I believe, about this.
Do you think that reality is making any headway in Australia, or is that kind of an outlier too, where they're all against their own coal, for example?
No. Not yet, at least. I've been talking with Australians for a long time, and there's nothing clear in their future regarding electricity generation. They're pushing renewables all over the place.
Do you think the recent problems in Spain have caused people to wake up there at all when the grid went down because of renewables?
Perhaps, yes. Yes, I'm working very close with Spain. I was going to travel there now in November, but the meeting, the conference was canceled. And yes, they're very interesting, as well as Hungary and Portugal. They have a mess with renewables, and they're very interested of making a report for them, the same as I made for Ireland at the beginning of this year. And yes, they are starting to do something. But first of all, they have to get rid of the socialist government. Otherwise, and even then, the problem with Europe is that they have the next stage of government, which is the EU Commission. So whatever you have as a government in your own country, you are locked, to find a word. You have a very low ceiling with the other government, which is the EU Commission. And the EU Commission is the one that has this Green Deal, very similar to one of the Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and the Green New Deal of Obama and Biden, remember?
I do.
Today is history, but you had it also. Well, that would cost Europe $1 trillion. And they're pushing that. So I don't know what is going on with what will finally happen with Europe, Hungary, Spain, Portugal, and I would also say the Netherlands are getting very, very nervous. They will do something. Remember the rights of the farmers 2 years ago, 1 year ago, throughout Europe, because the attack on nitrogenous fertilizers that produce nitrous oxide, a very strong greenhouse gas. Remember those riots all over Europe? Well, that can start again. I don't know. Really, I hope the best for them, because they're going down, as President Trump said in the UN in his speech.
Last question is, have you encountered the work of Catherine Porter at all? All of a sudden, I'm seeing her. She's from the UK, and she's been on a lot of podcasts and getting some traction, saying similar stuff to you about renewable energy.
Yeah, I've watched her programs many times. She's amazing. No, I don't know her. I've never been in touch with her. I would like, but I don't know. I haven't met her.
Okay. Any other points you want to make before we finish this one up here?
No, just to say I'm so happy for you in America. How things are going there is in such a short time. So good things are coming for you. Unfortunately, not for us.
On that note, we'll finish up, but thanks a lot for all that you do, Douglas Pollock. Talk to you next time.
Okay, thanks to you, Tom. Super nice to be with you again.